Hey everyone. Look, we all think we know ancient Egypt. You've seen the movies, the massive pyramids, the mummies, and those shiny gold masks. But the day-to-day jobs people actually had were totally insane. Today, you might complain about sitting in an office or working a retail shift. But back then, the career ladder looked very different. We are talking about guys whose entire job was carrying the king's sandals, people who got paid to scream and cry at funerals, and a doctor hired specifically to look after the royal rear end. I'm just a guy reading stories about history, so subscribe if you want to stay in the loop. It really helps out. Also, let me know where you are watching from tonight. I love seeing where everyone is located. Let's get into the payroll. So, you're thinking about the ancient world, and you probably see guys hauling giant blocks of stone, or farmers covered in mud by the Nile. And sure, that was part of it, but if you really want to understand how Egypt actually functioned, you have to stop thinking about a construction site and start thinking about a massive, high-pressure corporate office. A really, really big one. See, the Egyptians were obsessed with organization. They didn't just wing it. They had layers of people doing jobs you've probably never even thought of. We call this a bureaucracy, but that's just a fancy word for a giant system of middle managers. It wasn't just a few rich guys at the top and everyone else at the bottom. There were thousands of scribes, inspectors, and accountants. They tracked everything. I mean everything. If you had a cow, they knew about it. If you grew a certain amount of grain, they had it written down on a piece of papyrus before you even harvested it. The whole society was shaped like a pyramid, and I don't just mean the big stone ones in the desert. At the very bottom, you had the farmers. They did the heavy lifting, growing the food that kept the whole machine running. Above them were the craftsmen and the soldiers. Then came the scribes and the priests, and way up at the top, sitting all by himself, was the Pharaoh. But here is the thing you have to wrap your head around. The Pharaoh wasn't just a king. He wasn't just a guy who wore a crown and told people what to do. He was a literal god on earth. Imagine if your boss didn't just sign your paycheck, but also controlled whether or not the sun came up tomorrow morning. That's the kind of pressure we're talking about. The Egyptians believed that if the pharaoh was happy and healthy, the world kept spinning. The Nile flooded on time, the crops grew, and nobody got invaded. If he wasn't doing his job, or if things were out of whack at the palace, everything could fall apart. Because of that, working for the pharaoh wasn't just a career choice, it was a religious duty. You weren't just showing up to earn a living, you were performing a vital service to keep the universe from collapsing into chaos. They had a word for this, but the main point is that they hated chaos more than anything. To them, the best way to fight chaos was to make sure everyone had a very specific, very clearly defined job. This is where things start to get a little bit weird. Since the pharaoh was a god, every single thing he did was sacred. His meals weren't just dinner, they were rituals. His clothes weren't just laundry, they were holy items. And his body? His body was the most important thing in the entire country. If the pharaoh's body wasn't working perfectly, the whole country was in trouble. This led to a level of specialization that would make a modern corporation look lazy. In most other places back then, if you were a doctor, you handled everything. You fixed a broken arm, you treated a fever, you pulled a tooth. They wanted specialists. They took the idea of specialization and pushed it as far as it could go. If there was a job to be done, no matter how tiny or how strange it sounds to us today, they created a title for it. They had people whose entire life was dedicated to one specific task. Think about it. There was probably a guy whose only job was to make sure the pharaoh's sandals were lined up straight. There was another guy who only dealt with the king's jewelry. They had specialists for different parts of the body, different types of food, and different parts of the palace. To us, this sounds like a lot of red tape. It sounds like they were overcomplicating things. But to an ancient Egyptian, this was the only way to live. They believed that if you focused on one tiny thing and did it perfectly every single day, you were doing your part to keep the world in order. It gave everyone a place. You knew exactly where you fit in the grand scheme of things. This mindset is exactly how you end up with some of the strangest job titles in human history. When you decide that every single inch of the king's body is a matter of national security, you eventually need a specialist for the parts that we usually don't talk about at the dinner table. And that's exactly what happened. They had a guy for everything, and I mean everything. That's how we get to the specific role that gave this story its name. Because in a world where every function of a god-king matters, someone has to be the guy who looks after the end of the line. To understand why a job like that even existed, you have to look at how the Egyptians saw the world. See, they didn't just like being clean. They were obsessed with it. It wasn't a hobby or a preference. It was a full-blown survival strategy. Think about where they lived. It was hot. I'm talking about the kind of heat that sticks to you the second you walk outside. If you didn't stay on top of your hygiene, the environment would eat you alive. You had the sun beating down on you all day, and you had the Nile River right there. The river was life, but it was also full of stuff that wanted to kill you. Parasites, bacteria, and bugs were everywhere. If you let yourself get dirty, you were basically inviting a disease to move in and take over. But the biggest enemy wasn't actually an invisible germ. It was lice. Ancient Egypt was crawling with them. We've found mummies from thousands of years ago that still have lice eggs stuck to their hair. It was a nightmare. So what did they do? They didn't bother with special combs or soaps. They just shaved everything. I mean everything. Men, women, and even the kids went completely bald. They used bronze razors that were probably blunt as a butter knife, and they scraped every single hair off their bodies just to give the bugs nowhere to hide. If you see a painting of an Egyptian with a big, beautiful head of hair, just know it was almost certainly a wig made of sheep's wool or human hair. Underneath that wig, they were as smooth as a river stone. This obsession with being hairless and scrubbed clean created a massive economy. You couldn't just do all this yourself. You needed a whole army of people to keep the population from falling apart. This created thousands of jobs that don't exist anymore. You had professional head shavers who spent their entire day scraping skin. You had laundrymen who spent 12 hours a day down by the river beating linen against rocks to get the sweat out. It was a world where staying clean was a full-time business for a huge chunk of the population. But there's a deeper level to this. It wasn't just about not itching or not smelling bad. For the Egyptians, being clean was a religious requirement. They had this concept called Ma'at. It was order, balance, and truth. If the world was following Ma'at, the sun rose on time, the Nile flooded the fields, and everybody had enough to eat. On the flip side, you had Isfet. That's just a fancy word for total chaos. To an Egyptian, dirt was Isfet. If you were covered in grime, you weren't just messy. You were actually helping chaos win. You were a walking, breathing threat to the balance of the universe. This meant that every time someone picked up a broom or washed a dish, they weren't just doing chores, they were soldiers in a war against the end of the world. That's the context you need to understand the gross jobs. If the whole universe depends on staying clean, then the guy who handles the dirtiest stuff is actually a hero. I'm serious. Think about the jars of urine they used. They didn't have modern chemicals, so they used what they had. They knew that old pee had ammonia in it, which is great for bleaching clothes or tanning leather. So someone had to collect it. Someone had to move it. Someone had to work with it all day. In our world, that sounds like a job you'd get as a punishment. But in their world, you were a vital part of the machine. You were taking something messy and turning it into something useful. You were turning chaos into order. Every job, even the ones that involved the back end of a king, was about protecting that balance. The Pharaoh wasn't just a boss, he was a living god. If the god king got a skin infection or a stomach bug because he wasn't being looked after properly, the Egyptians believed the whole country would suffer. The crops would dry up, the enemies would invade, the world would literally fall apart. So, when you see a man holding a jar of something unpleasant or spending his day looking at things most people would turn away from, don't feel sorry for him. He didn't feel sorry for himself. He was proud. He had a title. He had a place in the system. He was the guy standing on the front lines, fighting the bugs and the filth so that the sun would keep rising. In a world of chaos, the man with the sponge was the only thing keeping the lights on. So, if the guy with the sponge was the unsung hero of the bathroom, let's look at the guys who handled the rest of the king's body. These weren't just servants. These were the ultimate insiders. Imagine you're the Pharaoh. You're a living god on earth. You don't just walk around like a regular guy. You have a whole team of people dedicated to making sure you look and feel like a deity every single second of the day. And one of the most important guys on that team? He was the man in charge of the shoes. It sounds like a punchline, right? The sandal bearer? But in ancient Egypt, this was a job people would kill for. Here's the deal. The Pharaoh was considered so holy that his feet weren't supposed to touch the ground in certain places. The dirt of the earth was for regular people, not for a god king. So, if he was walking through a temple or a sacred courtyard, he needed a guy right behind him. This guy didn't just carry the shoes. He was like a human luxury valet who never left the king's side. Think about the logistics of that. You're following the most powerful man in the world. You're standing just inches away from him while he's making huge decisions, talking to generals or praying to the gods. You see him when he trips. You see him when he's sweating. You know exactly what his feet look like, which might sound gross, but in that world, it meant you were closer to him than almost anyone else. You held his property. You held a piece of his dignity. Because he trusted you with his sandals, he probably trusted you with his secrets, too. This wasn't just about footwear. It was about proximity. In the palace, proximity was power. If you were the guy holding the shoes, you were the guy everyone else had to talk to if they wanted to get a message to the king. You were the filter. But as much as the sandal bearer knew, there was another group of guys who were even deeper in the inner circle. These were the royal manicurists. And if you think clipping nails is a boring 9 to 5, you couldn't be more wrong. This job was basically a high-level security clearance with a side of grooming. We actually know a lot about these guys because of two men named Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep. They lived about 4,500 years ago, and they were the head manicurists for the king. They didn't just have a job, they had a legacy. They were buried in a massive, beautiful tomb that looks like something built for a prince. Why? Because cutting the king's hair and nails was one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. Not dangerous because the king was mean, but dangerous because of magic. Back then, people didn't just think hair and nails were dead cells. They thought those things were parts of your soul. They believed in something called sympathetic magic. The idea was simple. If I have a piece of you, I can hurt you. If an enemy got a hold of a single lock of the Pharaoh's hair or one of his fingernail clippings, they could use it to cast a spell. They could make him go blind, make him lose a war, or even kill him from a distance. It was like having the king's computer passwords or his bank pin. So when Ninkhnum and Khnumhotep sat down to trim the king's nails, the pressure was through the roof. They weren't just making him look good for a party. They were protecting the state. Every single sliver of nail had to be caught. Every hair that fell from his head had to be collected. They couldn't just sweep it into the trash and call it a day. They had to account for every bit of it and then dispose of it in a way that no one would ever find. They probably buried it or burned it in secret rituals where nobody was allowed to watch. Can you imagine the stress? You're sitting there with a sharp bronze tool, inches away from the king's hand. If you slip and cut him, you've spilled royal blood. If you lose a nail clipping, you've potentially handed a weapon to an assassin. You had to be perfect, you had to be invisible, and you had to be 100% loyal. This is why these two guys were so rich and famous. They were the ultimate bodyguards. They didn't carry swords, they carried grooming kits. The king spent more time with his manicurists than he did with most of his advisors. Think about it. When you're getting your nails done, you're sitting still, you're relaxed, you're talking. These guys heard the king complain about his day. They saw him without his crown on. They saw the human being behind the mask of the god. They knew his moods better than his own family did. In the tomb of Ninkhnum and Khnumhotep, there's a famous picture of them standing so close that their noses are touching. In Egyptian art, that's a huge deal. It shows a level of intimacy and connection that you rarely see. It tells us that these two weren't just employees, they were a team, and they were vital to the king's life. They were the ones who kept him safe from the invisible world of ghosts and curses, while the sandal-bearer kept him off the dirty ground. It just goes to show you that in ancient Egypt, there was no such thing as a small job. If you were touching the king, you were part of the machine that kept the universe running. Whether you were cleaning his feet or clipping his nails, you were the line between order and total chaos. And in a world where a stray fingernail could bring down an empire, the man with the scissors was the most important man in the room. But even the best manicure can't stop the clock. Eventually, everyone died. And in ancient Egypt, dying was a very loud business. If you think a modern funeral is awkward because of the silence, you would have hated the Egyptian version. For them, silence was a total disaster. Silence meant you were alone. It meant the gods weren't listening. It meant the person who died wasn't important enough for anyone to care. So, if you were a family with a bit of money, you didn't just sit in a room and sniffle into a tissue. You hired help. You hired the kites. They were called kites after the birds, those hawks that make a high, piercing shriek. But these weren't birds, they were women, professional mourners. This was the ultimate gig economy job for women living in the local villages. One day you're at home baking bread or spinning flax, and the next day you get a call because the guy down the road just kicked the bucket. You grab your gear, you leave your kids with a neighbor, and you go to work. You were getting paid to lose your mind in public. Now, I want you to imagine the scene. A body is being carried toward a tomb. In the front, you have the priests and the family, but trailing behind them is a pack of women who look like they are having the worst day of their lives. That was the job.
And there were very specific rules. To be a professional kite, you couldn't have any children of your own with you. You had to be fully committed to the stranger in the coffin. You had to look like your entire world had just collapsed, even if you didn't actually know the guy's name. The performance was intense. You didn't just show up and walk. You had to scream. I am talking about top-of-your-lungs, gut-wrenching wails that could be heard 3 blocks away. But the noise was just the beginning. You had to look the part. You didn't wear your nice, clean, white linen. You wore rags. You let your hair down and got it messy. As you walked, you would reach down into the street, grab handfuls of dirt and mud, and just dump it right on your head. You'd smear it into your skin and your hair until you looked like a mess. And then came the scratching. Remember those nails we talked about? Well, the kites used theirs. They would take their nails and dig them into their own cheeks and chests. They would scratch until they drew blood. They wanted those red marks to show. They wanted everyone watching to see that their grief was so big it was physically hurting them. If you weren't bleeding or covered in dirt by the end of the procession, you probably weren't getting a 5-star review from the family. You might wonder why anyone would do this. Well, for one, it paid. You'd get paid in bread, jars of beer, or sometimes even silver if the family was really loaded. If you were the woman who could cry the loudest and bleed the most, you were the MVP of the funeral circuit. You were a walking, screaming status symbol. For the family, the number of kites they hired told the neighbors exactly how much they were worth. If you only had 2 women crying, you were a nobody. If you had 20 women tearing their hair out and screaming your name, you were a legend. But it wasn't just about showing off. There was a deep religious reason for all this noise. The Egyptians believed that when the god Osiris was killed, his sisters, Isis and Nephthys, wandered the land wailing for him. They were the ones who found his body and helped him come back to life in the next world. By hiring these women, the family was basically staging a play. The 2 lead mourners would actually take on the roles of Isis and Nephthys. They weren't just village women anymore. They were acting as goddesses to make sure the dead guy didn't get lost in the dark. They were his protection. The kites had to cry on command. If the procession stopped to move a cart or talk to a priest, you couldn't just stop and check your phone. You had to keep the energy up. You had to stay in character for hours under a sun that would melt lead. It was physically exhausting. Your throat would be raw from the screaming. Your face would be stinging from the scratches and the salt in your tears. You were a professional athlete of grief. If you did your job right, the dead person had a smooth ride to the afterlife. The noise you made woke up the gods and told them someone important was coming. You were the bridge between the silence of the grave and the life of the next world. You made sure that death wasn't quiet, and in ancient Egypt, that was the greatest gift you could give. You were a kite, and your scream was the most important sound in the village. Not bad for a side hustle. So you're done screaming, and the village knows that your friend or your dad has passed away. You've done your part as a kite, but now the real work starts. In ancient Egypt, dying was just the beginning of a very long, very expensive process. If you wanted to live forever, you couldn't just get buried in the dirt and call it a day. You needed to be preserved. You needed to be mummified. And that's where things get really weird, because the first person you had to call was a guy who had the most stressful job in the world. Let's talk about the parachistes. That's a fancy Greek word, but I'll make it simpler for you. Everyone just called him the slitter. Now the slitter was a professional. He was part of the embalming team, the guys who turned a body into a mummy. But he wasn't the boss. He wasn't the guy doing the fancy prayers or wrapping the linen. He had one job, and it was a job that nobody else wanted to touch. See, the Egyptians had a massive problem. To make a mummy, you have to get the organs out. If you leave the stomach and the liver inside, the body is going to rot from the inside out in a matter of days. If the body rots, the soul has nowhere to stay. If the soul has no home, you don't get an afterlife. You just disappear. So someone has to cut that body open to get the stuff out. That sounds simple enough, right? Here's the catch. Ancient Egyptian law was very strict about one thing. You do not hurt a human body, ever. It was considered a huge crime to mutilate or damage a corpse. It was a sin against the gods. So now you've got this crazy situation. You have to cut the body to save the person's soul, but the second you cut the body, you are a criminal who has committed a terrible sin. It's a total trap. It's like being hired to paint someone's house, but as soon as you touch the wall with a brush, the family tries to throw you in jail for vandalism. This is where the slitter comes in. He was the designated fall guy. He was the man who took the blame so everyone else could go to heaven. On the day of the mummification, the slitter would show up at the workshop. They called it the Beautiful House, which is a pretty nice name for a place that smelled like old meat and vinegar. The body would be laid out on a stone table. The head priests would be there, wearing their masks and saying their prayers. Everything was very formal. The slitter would walk up to the table, and he wouldn't be carrying a normal metal knife. He used a piece of obsidian. If you've never seen obsidian, it's volcanic glass. It's jet black, and it is incredibly sharp. It's sharper than the razors you use today. It's an old-school tool, something from the Stone Age, and they used it because it was traditional. The slitter would find a spot on the left side of the dead person's belly. He'd take that glass blade, and with one quick move, he'd make a deep cut. He didn't hang around to chat. He didn't help with the rest of the surgery. He just made that one opening so the other priests could reach in and do their work. But the second that blade touched the skin, the mood in the room changed. The other priests, the ones who literally hired him to be there, would suddenly start acting like he just committed a murder. They would start shouting at him. They'd call him names, and then they'd start picking up stones from the ground. The slitter didn't wait for them to aim. He knew what was coming. As soon as he made that cut, he would drop the knife and start running. He'd bolt out the door of the workshop and head for the street. Behind him, the priests would start hurling rocks at him as hard as they could. They weren't just tossing pebbles either. They were trying to hit him. They were punishing him for the crime of cutting the body. Imagine that being your Tuesday morning. You show up to work, you do exactly what your boss told you to do, and then your boss and all your coworkers try to stone you to death while you run for your life down the road. It was all a big show, of course. It was a ritual. They had to prove to the gods that they hated the crime of cutting the body. By throwing stones at the slitter, they were saying, "Look, we're the good guys." It was a legal loophole. The slitter got the blame, and everyone else got to keep their hands clean. Because of this, the slitter was a total outcast. He didn't live in the middle of town with everyone else. He usually lived in a special area with the other embalmers, far away from the regular people. People were afraid of him. If you saw him walking toward you on the street, you'd probably cross to the other side. He was the guy who touched the dead. He was the guy who committed the sin. He spent his whole life being the person everyone needed, but nobody wanted to be around. He'd go home with bruises from the rocks, wash the dust off his face, and wait for the next person to die so he could do it all over again. He was the man who saved your soul by becoming a criminal. It wasn't a glamorous life, and it certainly wasn't a peaceful one. But without the slitter and his glass knife, the Great Pyramids would just be full of empty rooms and dusty bones. He was the one who made the afterlife possible, even if he had to run through a hail of stones to do it. Not exactly the kind of job you'd find on a modern career website, but in the land of the Pharaohs, it was the only way to keep the gods happy.
Keeping the gods happy was a full-time job. But if you thought running through a hail of stones was a bad day at the office, wait until you see the guys in charge of the pets. Now, when I say pets, I don't mean a fluffy cat or a golden retriever. I mean a 15-foot-long crocodile that thinks you look like a light snack. In ancient Egypt, if you wanted to get on the good side of the god Sobek, you didn't just pray. You had to take care of his living representatives on Earth. And that meant someone had to get hands-on with some of the most dangerous predators on the planet. You work at a temple in a place like Crocodilopolis. Yes, that was a real place. In the middle of the temple, there's a massive stone pond. Inside that pond lives a single crocodile named Petsukos. He's not just any reptile. The priests believe he is the living spirit of the god himself. Because of that, he lives a better life than most humans. He wears gold earrings. They literally pierced his ears. He has gold bracelets on his front legs. He spends his days lounging on the sand while people bring him gifts. But the crocodile can't feed himself. That wouldn't be very godlike. That's where you come in. Every day, you and a team of helpers have to head down to the water. You're carrying a plate of grain, some pieces of meat, and a jar of honey-mixed wine. You can't just toss the food over a fence and walk away. The ritual says the god has to be fed properly. So, while one guy holds the crocodile's tail to keep him from spinning around, you and another brave soul have to approach the head. You reach out and grab the snout. You have to physically pry those massive muscular jaws open with your bare hands. One slip and you aren't just a waiter anymore, you're the main course. Once you've got his mouth propped open, you start stuffing the food in. You shove the meat and the grain cakes past those rows of teeth. Then comes the weird part. You take the jar of wine and pour it right down his throat. You are literally giving a crocodile a happy hour. You do this every single day. If the crocodile gets sick or dies on your watch, people think the god is angry. If the Nile doesn't flood and the crops fail, guess who everyone blames? It's a high-pressure gig with zero room for error. But as scary as the crocodile job was, at least you only had one big lizard to deal with. If you worked at the ibis farms, you had a completely different set of problems. This wasn't about pampering one holy pet. This was an industrial-scale operation. The Egyptians believed that if you wanted to send a message to the god Thoth, you needed to give him a mummified ibis bird. It was like buying a postage stamp, but the stamp was a dead bird. The demand for these birds was through the roof. Everyone wanted one. So the priests set up these massive bird factories. If you worked here, your life was a constant cycle of noise and filth. You'd be in charge of thousands upon thousands of these long-beaked birds. Picture a giant enclosure packed so tight you can barely see the ground. You have to feed them, make sure they don't peck each other to death, and collect the eggs. The sound was the first thing that hit you. Thousands of birds squawking and flapping all at once. It was a constant, high-pitched screaming that never stopped, day or night. Then there was the smell. You're in the middle of the desert heat. You've got thousands of birds eating, and more importantly, thousands of birds pooping. The floor of the farm was a thick, slippery carpet of bird droppings. You had to walk through it every day. The dust from the dried poop and the feathers would get into your lungs and your eyes. You'd go home every night covered in a layer of white grime and bird stink that wouldn't wash off. Your job was to keep the production line moving. You'd hatch the chicks, raise them until they were the right size, and then hand them over to the priests. And here is where the job gets a bit dark. The priests didn't wait for these birds to die of old age. They'd break their necks, dry them out in salt, and wrap them in linen bandages. Then they'd sell them to pilgrims who wanted to make an offering. This was a massive business. We know this because archaeologists have found underground tunnels packed from floor to ceiling with these bird mummies. In one spot alone, there were 4 million of them. 4 million. Think about the amount of work it took to raise 4 million birds just to kill them and put them in a jar. But because the demand was so high, the workers often got squeezed. If the farm didn't produce enough birds one month, the pilgrims still wanted to buy their offerings. So the workers and the priests started cutting corners. They'd take a few feathers, maybe some bones from a bird that died of a disease, and wrap them up in the shape of a full bird. Sometimes they'd just wrap a piece of wood or some dried mud. They'd sell these fake mummies to unsuspecting people who thought they were doing something holy. If you were the guy working the farm, you were part of this giant, smelly machine. You spent your life knee-deep in bird waste, breathing in feathers, and participating in a massive religious scam. You weren't a priest living in a clean temple. You were the laborer making sure the holy industry didn't run out of inventory. It was loud, it was gross, and it was exhausting. But just like the guy prying open the crocodile's mouth, you were a vital part of the economy. In ancient Egypt, the gods had a huge appetite, and someone had to be the one to keep them fed, no matter how much bird poop they had to shovel to make it happen. Shoveling bird poop was one thing, but if you wanted to move up in the world, you had to get closer to the king. And I mean really close. Those were great, don't get me wrong, but there was another title that sounds completely insane to us today, yet it was one of the highest honors a person could have. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that sounds like a job for a doctor or a midwife. But this wasn't a medical role, it was a political one. We find this title all over the records from the Old Kingdom. These were the guys who built the pyramids, so they weren't exactly stupid. They were organized, they were practical, and they were obsessed with how the world worked. To them, the opener of the king's placenta was a job for the elite. It was a role for the people the king trusted most in the entire world. To understand why this was such a big deal, you have to look at how the Egyptians viewed birth. They didn't think a baby just showed up on its own. They believed that when a king was born, he brought a friend along with him. They looked at the placenta and didn't see a piece of biology to be thrown in the trash. They saw it as the king's stillborn twin. They believed this twin was a spiritual guide. It was a secret, invisible double that lived in the spirit world while the king lived in the physical one. They called it the king's ka, or a part of his soul. So if you're the king, you can't just let your spiritual twin sit in a jar in a back room. You need that twin to be with you. You need it to lead the way. That's where the job comes in. The opener was the person responsible for this spiritual twin. They didn't just look after it, they showed it off. They took the actual physical placenta, dried it out until it was tough and preserved, and then they did something that would look very weird on a modern street corner. They stuck it on a pole. Think about a big parade, maybe a Thanksgiving parade or a victory march after a war. You've got the music playing and the crowds cheering,
At the very front of the line, even before the pharaoh himself, you'd see a man holding a long wooden stick. On top of that stick was the representation of the dried-up placenta. The man holding that stick was the opener of the king's placenta. He was literally opening the way for the king by carrying his spiritual twin ahead of him. Imagine you're that guy for a second. You're dressed in the finest white linen. You've got heavy gold collars around your neck and probably a wig that cost more than a house. You're standing in the brutal Egyptian sun, and you're holding a pole with a piece of a birth sack on it. You aren't embarrassed. You're proud. You're the one clearing the path. You're the one making sure the king's spirit is safe. If you trip, or if you let that pole tilt, you aren't just messing up a parade. You're putting the king's soul in danger. The people in the crowd weren't grossed out either. They didn't see a dried organ. They saw a symbol of the king's power and his connection to the gods. They cheered for the guy with the stick just as much as they cheered for the king.
It was a visible reminder that the pharaoh wasn't just a man. He was a divine being with a twin in the spirit world. You didn't get this job by applying for it at a local office. You were picked because you were part of the inner circle. Most of the men who held this title were high-ranking nobles. Some were even related to the pharaoh. It was a way to show everyone that you were the king's right-hand man. If the king trusts you to carry his twin, he trusts you with everything else. You were the one who had his ear. You were the one who sat with him during dinner and advised him on how to run the country. In our world, we judge a job by how clean it is or how much paperwork you do. In their world, they judged a job by how close it got you to the divine. Handling a placenta wasn't dirty work because it wasn't just a body part. It was a holy object. It was a piece of the king's own divinity. The man who carried it was basically a bodyguard for the king's soul. So when you see those old drawings of Egyptian parades, look closely at the guys at the front. Look at the sticks they're carrying. You'll see all sorts of symbols, hawks, jackals, and strange circular shapes. That circular shape is often the placenta, and the guy holding it is one of the most powerful people in the world. He didn't mind the smell or the weird looks we might give him today. He had a job to do. He had to make sure the king and his twin stayed together, keeping the whole universe in balance while he marched through the dust. It's a strange thought, I know, but it shows you how different their reality was. To them, the physical world and the spirit world were mashed together. You couldn't have one without the other, and someone had to be the bridge. Someone had to be the guy who grabbed the pole, held his head high, and walked out in front of the most powerful man on earth, carrying a piece of his birth with him for everyone to see. It wasn't just a job, it was a statement. It said that the king was protected, the gods were happy, and the opener of the king's placenta was the one making sure it stayed that way. So, we just got finished talking about the guy in charge of the king's placenta. That sounds like a pretty strange way to make a living, right? But I'm telling you, we haven't even reached the summit of this mountain yet. If you think the placenta guy had it weird, wait until you meet the man at the very top of the pile. This is the peak. This is the job that makes every other weird job in history look like a standard 9-to-5 in an office cubicle. I want you to imagine a guy walking around the royal palace. He's dressed in the finest linen. He's wearing gold jewelry that costs more than a small village. People step aside when he walks down the hall. They whisper his name with respect. And his title? His official government-sanctioned title was the Shepherd of the Royal Anus.
I am not kidding you. The Egyptians actually called him the Neriu Fuit. Now, your first instinct is probably to laugh. I get it. It sounds like a prank. But in ancient Egypt, this wasn't a joke. It was one of the most serious and respected positions in the entire government. To understand why, you have to understand how these people thought about the human body. They didn't see it the way we do. To them, the body was like a map of the Nile River. Think about the Nile for a second. It's the lifeblood of Egypt. As long as the water is flowing, everything is great. The crops grow, the people eat, and the kingdom stays rich. But if the river gets blocked or the water starts to sit still and rot, the whole system breaks down. They applied that exact same logic to the pharaoh's body. They believed the body had these internal channels called metu. These channels carried blood, air, and waste. If those channels got blocked, you got sick. And if the pharaoh got sick, the whole world was in trouble because he was a living god. So, the shepherd of the royal anus was basically the king's personal plumber. His entire career was dedicated to making sure the royal pipes never got backed up. He was the royal proctologist, but with a religious twist. His main tool for the job was the enema. Today, we think of that as a direct medical procedure you'd only get in a hospital if something was really wrong, but back then, it was a regular health habit. The story goes that the Egyptians actually learned how to do this by watching a bird called the ibis. They saw the bird using its long, curved beak to clean itself out with water, and they thought, hey, that bird looks pretty healthy. They didn't just do it for medicine, they did it because they were obsessed with being clean. To them, being clean wasn't just about smelling good, it was about being holy. If you had waste sitting inside you, you were spiritually dirty. The shepherd would spend his days preparing special blends of water, oils, and herbs. He had to know exactly what he was doing. This wasn't a job for some random servant. This was a high-level specialist. He would use a hollowed-out bull's horn or a reed to perform the procedure. He made sure the pharaoh had regular bowel movements every single day. If the king was regular, the kingdom was safe. It sounds gross to us, but to them, this guy was literally keeping the god-king pure. But here is where it gets really interesting. Forget the medical stuff for a minute and think about the politics. Think about the social standing. If you wanted power, you had to be near the king. Most people, even high-ranking nobles, only saw the pharaoh when he was sitting on his throne, wearing a heavy crown, surrounded by guards. He was a distant, scary figure. But the shepherd saw the pharaoh when the crown was off. He saw him when he was naked. He saw him when he was in pain or bloated or just plain uncomfortable. When you are performing an enema on a man, there is no majesty left in the room. There is no mystery. It's just two guys in a very small, very private space. This meant the shepherd of the royal anus was one of the few people on earth who saw the pharaoh as a human being. He was with the king during his most vulnerable, private moments. And when you're in that position, you start to talk. You're sitting there, waiting for the medicine to work, and the king starts venting about his problems. He tells you about the general he doesn't trust. He complains about his wife. He asks you what the people in the city are saying. Because the shepherd was so low profile in a social sense, I mean, nobody is bragging about this job at a dinner party, the king felt he could trust him. The shepherd wasn't a threat. He wasn't a general with an army or a priest with a temple. He was just the guy who kept the king's stomach from hurting. That trust turned into massive political power. If you were a crooked official and you knew the shepherd was going to be alone with the king for an hour every morning, you would do anything to get on that shepherd's good side. You'd give him gifts. You'd give him land. You'd beg him to mention your name in a positive way while the king was, well, occupied. The shepherd became a gatekeeper. He could influence the most powerful man on the planet just by whispering a few words while doing his job. So you have this wild contrast. On one hand, you have a man whose entire life revolves around the king's butt. It's messy, it's intimate, and it's probably pretty smelly. But on the other hand, that same man is one of the most influential people in the palace. He's wealthy, he's respected, and he has the king's ear in a way that the highest-ranking generals could only dream of. It tells you a lot about how the Egyptians saw the world. They didn't see a divide between the gross parts of life and the holy parts of life. To them, it was all connected. Keeping the king's body flowing was just as important as winning a war or building a pyramid. And the man who did it, he wasn't a joke. He was a guardian. He was the shepherd. And as long as he did his job, the king stayed healthy, the gods stayed happy, and the Nile kept flowing. It's probably the only time in history where being a royal proctologist was the ultimate power move.
But here is the thing about being that close to the king. It sounds great until you realize that proximity is a double-edged sword. Sure, you get the prestige, but you also get a front-row seat to all the danger. If you're the guy who handles the king's most private business, you're also the guy who can get close enough to kill him. And in ancient Egypt, people were very aware of that. The stakes weren't just high, they were life and death every single day. Let's talk about the food tasters. On paper, this job sounds like a dream for anyone who likes a free meal. You get to eat the best food in the world. You're eating prime beef, honey-soaked bread, and the freshest grapes, while the average person is eating hard bread and onions. But you aren't eating for fun. You're eating to see if you drop dead. Every time the king sat down to dinner, he had a guy standing there whose entire job was to be a human guinea pig. If someone wanted to take out the king, they weren't going to march an army up to the palace. That's too hard. They were going to slip something into his wine or his stew. So the taster takes a bite. Then he waits. He has to sit there under the gaze of the most powerful man on earth and wait to see if his stomach starts burning or if his throat starts closing up. If he stays standing, the king eats. If he falls over, well, the king finds a new taster. It wasn't a job you took because you were a foodie. You took it because you were expendable. You were a living warning light, and your life was worth less than a single bowl of soup. Then you have the harem guards. These guys lived in a part of the palace that most people never even saw. The harem wasn't just a place for wives. It was a massive, high-security wing where the king's family and all the royal women lived. The guards were the gatekeepers. They saw who went in and who came out. They heard the gossip. They knew who was mad at the king and who was plotting to take his place. Because they were so close to the inner circle, they were the ultimate insiders. But that insider access turned into a nightmare during the reign of Ramses III. This is one of the most famous stories of a job gone wrong in history. Ramses was an old man, and he had a lot of wives. One of them, a woman named T, decided she didn't want to wait for the king to die of old age. She wanted her son on the throne right now. But she couldn't just walk up and stab the king. She needed the people who worked there. She needed the help. She started recruiting the very people who were supposed to protect the king. She went to the harem guards. She went to the pantry overseers. She even got the royal magicians involved. They were the ones who could move through the palace without anyone looking twice. They were invisible because they were always there. The plotters used their access to smuggle messages out of the palace. The guards, instead of doing their jobs, started letting people in. They turned a blind eye while the conspiracy grew. Eventually, they made their move. They attacked the king. For a long time, historians weren't sure if they actually killed him. But modern CT scans on his mummy show that his throat was cut all the way to the bone. They got him. The people he trusted to guard his most private spaces were the ones who let the killers in. But here is where the story gets really dark. They didn't get away with it. The king's loyalists caught the plotters almost immediately, and the Egyptian legal system didn't play around. We have the actual trial records from this case. It's a document that lists exactly what happened to these people. They didn't just give them a quick death. They wanted to make sure everyone knew what happened when you betrayed your job. The guards and the servants who helped the queen were brought before a special court. The records show that for many of them, the punishment was physical mutilation. They didn't just kill them, they cut off their noses, they cut off their ears. Think about that for a second. In ancient Egypt, your face was your identity. If you walked around without a nose, everyone who looked at you knew exactly what you did. You were a walking billboard for treason. It was a mark of shame that followed you until you died. And according to their religion, it followed you into the afterlife too. They believed you needed a whole body to get into the next world, so losing your nose was like being killed twice. For the higher-ranking officials and the king's own son, the punishment was a bit different, but just as grim. They weren't publicly mutilated. Instead, they were given the choice to take their own lives. The court would basically say, "We've found you guilty. Here is a jar of poison or a blade. We're going to leave the room now." If they didn't do it, the state would do it for them, and it would be much, much worse. Most of them chose the quick way out. One of the sons, a guy named Pentawar, was forced to kill himself right there. We think we found his mummy, too. He was buried in a goat skin, which was considered unclean by the Egyptians. He wasn't even given a proper burial. He was tossed away like trash. This whole mess shows you the true reality of these strange jobs. We look back and think it's funny that a guy was the shepherd of the anus, or that someone's whole life was tasting figs for a king. But for the people in those roles, it was a high-stakes gamble. You were stepping into a world where your proximity to the king made you a target. One day you're the most trusted person in the palace, and the next you're losing your nose because you got caught in the middle of a palace coup. Being close to power didn't make you safe, it just made you the first person people looked at when something went wrong. Whether you were checking the king's health or guarding his wives, you were always one mistake away from a very messy end. The king might have been a god on earth, but for the people working these jobs, he was a boss who could literally have you erased from history if you blinked at the wrong time. It was a career path where the benefits were great, but the retirement plan usually involved a very sharp knife. But here's the thing about those high-stakes jobs. They only work as long as the system stays the same. And for Egypt, the system was about to get hit by a freight train. It started with the Greeks. Alexander the Great showed up and took over the whole place. He didn't just bring soldiers, he brought a totally new way of thinking. The Greeks liked the Egyptian style, sure. They even tried to act like pharaohs to keep the peace, but they didn't really live it. They kept the temples open, but they started mixing their own gods in with the local ones. You started seeing these weird mashups where the old traditions were being watered down. Then the Romans rolled in, and that's when things got really rough for the specialists. The Romans were practical, no-nonsense people. They liked roads, they liked huge armies, and they really, really liked taxes. They looked at the massive budget for keeping the Pharaoh's spirit clean and healthy, and they just didn't see the point. To a Roman governor, paying a guy to be the shepherd of the anus wasn't a sacred duty. It wasn't about protecting the king's health in the afterlife. To them, it was just a giant waste of taxpayer money. They started cutting the funding.
They didn't see the value in the old rituals, and they certainly didn't want to pay for them. The real blow, the one that finally killed the profession, wasn't from a sword or a tax collector. It came from ideas. For thousands of years, the whole engine of Egypt ran on one idea. You had to keep the body perfect for the next life. If you didn't have your specialized doctors and your mummification teams, you were basically toast once you died. You needed those guys to make sure you were ready for eternity. But then, Christianity started spreading across the desert. This new religion changed everything. The new followers didn't believe you needed a preserved body to get into heaven. They didn't think the gods wanted millions of mummified animals as gifts or bribes. Suddenly, the demand for these weird specialized jobs just vanished. Think about the guys working in the animal mummification factories. These places were massive operations. They were churning out thousands of mummies every single month. They had guys who did nothing but wrap cats or prepare ibises. Then, almost overnight, the orders stopped coming in. The market just crashed. The temples, which were basically the biggest employers in the entire country, started closing their doors. One by one, the lights went out. If you were a specialist who spent your whole life learning the secrets of the Pharaoh's digestive tract, you were suddenly out of luck. There was no backup plan back then. You couldn't just go get a job at a local clinic, because those didn't really exist. Your entire career, your status, and your paycheck were all based on a religion that people were walking away from. The specialized titles were the first things to go. People stopped writing them down on papyrus. They stopped carving them into the stone walls of tombs. The knowledge that had been passed down from father to son for hundreds of years just evaporated. Those guys who held the highest positions in the land ended up as just regular people trying to find a way to get their next meal. The shepherd of the anus wasn't a noble title anymore. It was just a weird memory of a world that didn't exist anymore.
By the time the Roman Empire fully took hold, the old ways were basically a ghost story. The factories were empty, the temples were being used for storage or just falling apart in the sun. The people who knew the secrets of the human body, the ones who were doing surgery and advanced medicine while the rest of the world was still living in huts, they were gone. They didn't leave a resume or a handbook. They just disappeared, taking their strange, specific jobs with them. It's a wild thought. One day you're the most important guy in the royal court, and the next, your job title doesn't even make sense to your own grandkids. The world moved on, and the shepherd was left with nothing to watch over.
So the shepherd is out of work. He's standing there with his tools, but the king has a new guy, or maybe the whole system just changed. It feels like a huge deal to him, but honestly, that's just how time works. We look back at a guy whose entire career was focused on the royal backside, and we laugh. We think it's the weirdest thing ever. But I want you to think about what you did today. You probably sat in a chair for 8 hours. You moved some data from one digital folder to another. You sent emails to people sitting 10 feet away from you. If you tried to explain middle management or being a social media consultant to a farmer in ancient Egypt, he'd think you were the crazy one. He'd ask why you aren't outside growing food or making sure the gods don't drown the world in a flood. The point is, nobody in the city of Thebes thought their job was a joke. When the shepherd woke up, he wasn't thinking about being a trivia fact in 3,000 years. He was thinking about his taxes. He was thinking about whether the beer was going to be cold when he got home. He was just a guy trying to make a living. He just happened to live in a world where the king's health was tied to the health of the whole country. If the king's gut wasn't working, the people believed the universe might actually stop. That's a lot of pressure for a guy with a jar of oil and a rag. It was a serious job with serious consequences. And think about the guys who carried the sandals. They literally just walked behind the king and held his shoes. That was it. But they were always there. They saw every meeting and heard every secret. They were important because they were close to the power. It's not that different from an assistant today who keeps the schedule for a CEO. We all have our version of carrying the sandals. We all have our version of holding a heavy stick with a statue on it. We do it because it's our identity. It's how we get our bread. It all seems normal when you're the one doing it. Nobody wakes up and thinks their own culture is bizarre. You just wake up, put on your clothes, and head to work. You do what you're told to do. You do it because you want to keep your family safe. You do it because you don't want to go hungry. We do the exact same thing right now. We wear suits and ties that don't really do anything. We sit in meetings that don't need to happen. We follow rules that won't make any sense to people in the future. That's the real secret of history. It's not just a list of wars or a bunch of big stone buildings. It's a massive collection of people just trying to get by. They wanted to pay their bills. They wanted to keep their gods happy so the rain would fall and the crops would grow. They did what they had to do to survive. Some people built the pyramids. Some people scrubbed the floors. And one guy had a job that makes us giggle today. But 3,000 years from now, someone is going to find a record of your life. They're going to look at your job title and have the exact same reaction. They'll see something like brand manager or data analyst, and they'll wonder how we ever survived. They'll think our lives were totally nonsensical. But to us, it's just Tuesday. It's just what we do to keep the lights on. The shepherd wasn't a punchline. He was just a guy with a job. And really, when you strip away the gold and the mummies, that's all history is. It's just us, trying our best, one strange job at a time.